On this Aircheck episode, we catch up with rock historian, producer, and former rock radio veteran, Denny Somach.
Denny talks to us about concert promotions, including an early show with Billy Joel, many career firsts, books he has authored, and his podcast.
Here we go.
Welcome to Aircheck, Season 3, a podcast about radio's personality from radio personalities, managers, consultants, owners, and your most humble hosts from Philadelphia, Rich DeSisto and Paul Kelly.
I'm Rich DeSisto.
And I'm Paul Kelly.
On this Aircheck session, we're excited to speak to one of the most successful independent producers of syndicated and network radio programming in the U.S.
His career began in the Allentown, Pennsylvania radio market in the early 1970s.
Right here on the Lehigh Valley's radio station, WSAN.
And he's still rocking strong, with many artist interviews.
I mean, when we did American Girl, it was inspired by Bo Diddley.
Well, Kids Are Alright was interesting because what I discovered there was that my music needed a link to early English Baroque music.
He's written some books, and he's got a new podcast to his name.
This is The Rock Podcast, the only podcast that matters. Now, I collect stories. My name is Denny Somach. I'm your host, and each episode, I'm going to bring you the inside story from my archives of rock.
Please welcome to Aircheck, Denny Somach.
Well, thanks for having me, guys. I'm very happy to be here. Very happy to be here.
Denny, you and I go back a few years together. We were both member of the WYSP Philadelphia alumni. I worked for you as a line producer as well on one of your syndicated shows, The Classics. Paul and I want to talk to you about all these things, but as we record this episode of Aircheck, you yourself have just launched a podcast of your own, The Rock Podcast with Denny Somach, and from what I already know about you, your new podcast is a culmination of your career. Tell us about that podcast, the concept, and how it all came about.
Well, yeah, I've been studying the podcast world for quite some time now. People have been after me to do a podcast. I wanted to learn more about it. So 3 or 4 years ago, I started to just really study it. I went to the first, in fact, I was on a panel at the first podcast convention, I think, which was in Philly about 4 years ago or so. And I just wanted to learn everything I could. And I made some samples, some demos, and just didn't feel right. I didn't want to do like mini radio shows. So the opportunity came about recently to test out something. And so I made a podcast utilizing my archives in a way that instead of a couple of disc jockeys sitting around talking about things and arguing about records and stuff, well, that's great. But I didn't want to do that because there's a million of those. So I figured, okay, if I'm going to argue and talk about The Doors or Crosby, Stills and Nash or whatever, I'm going to have those guys on. Now, you can't always get those guys, and some of them are actually dead. But I was able to look at the library and go, I think I can have just about anybody I want on this show. So that's what the basis of it was I'm going to tell the stories with the artists themselves actually telling the stories. And we do new interviews, too, along the way. So that was the idea behind it. I'm trying to actually become the inside baseball of rock. I mean, really inside, but not so inside that you can't enjoy it if you're a rock fan.
So what are the episodes that you have so far that you could talk about that's already out there? And maybe if you wanted to give us a tease of who else you've got on your upcoming season.
I think we're going to complete the first season. We've got about 8 done already. We're getting great response. The stories are getting amazing results. We're doing a lot of social media, which is not the easiest thing in the world because that's not where I came from. It's working. I'm enjoying it. And we're getting all sorts of great guests. And we're having a great time doing it.
So one more time, what's the name of it and where can somebody go to find it, to listen to it?
It's called The Rock Podcast, and it's available at all like Apple and through Podcast One and through Spotify, wherever you get podcasts. You can also go to therockpodcast.com website, and you can click on the link that's on there. You can also go to my website, DennySomach.com, and there's a link to get on there. So it comes out right now. We've been putting them out one a week. The new episodes drop Thursday. The first one was John Bonham's Salute to John Bonham, which I had all these pieces left over from over the years. As you well know, Rich, we always had Zeppelin stuff on everywhere. And then the second episode, I got a call from John Densmore, The Doors. He had a book coming out. So decided I'll make the second episode about them, and we'll get him in for a new interview along with the classic stuff. And that's where it's been going. And like I said, I'm very excited. We're getting great response.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun bringing up names of those musicians that you've had time spent with them, in your career and recently with this new podcast of yours. And we'll have fun throughout this session to hear you tell those stories. One of those early moments, though, was even before you even cracked open a microphone at your first real radio gig, and it came during a performance with a musician from Long Island, an unknown then, by the name of Billy Joel.
Please welcome Billy Joel, Columbia recording artist, with his band.
I went to college to become a business major and sort of got caught up in the college radio station. One thing led to another, and I got a part-time job at a real radio station where I was going to school. And then one thing led to another, and then I ended up switching my major. They didn't have communications back then, so I had to be art/English was my new major as opposed to business. This is in the 70s. The station I was working for, WSAN, which was an album rock station, had started playing album stuff at night and eventually went 24 hours. And I was lucky enough to be there. And you know how it works. Somebody gets fired, you're there. Okay, you're on till we get somebody. They don't get anybody. Next thing you know, you're a DJ. So I got to rearrange my schedule, and I go to school the whole time I'm working, and I'm doing the morning show, 6 to 9 a.m., and then I'd come back and do 12 to 2 in the afternoon. And in between, I had a class, and then in the afternoon, I had a class, and then in the evening, I had a class. So I did that because I figured, why not? Rather than working at the 7-Eleven for extra money, which you need to do during college. These stations started doing promotional concerts, $1, $2, things like that. And I had seen a guy in 71, 72, the first time I went to a college broadcasting convention. He was playing there. His new album had just come out, Cold Spring Harbor, and he was there along with a new group called Loggins and Messina, another woman named Tanya Tucker, Todd Rundgren, Randy Burns and the Skydog Band, and I can't remember who else, but anyway, all these bands played. And when Billy Joel sat down at the piano and just played for 30 minutes, he did all the songs plus a couple that hadn't been on the album on Cold Spring Harbor. I was like absolutely blown away. I'd never seen anything like that quickly. Just blew me away. And they were giving out copies of his album at this convention. So of course I brought it back, and you're allowed to play whatever you want. I started playing it in Allentown, and people really liked it. And then people couldn't buy it. It was on an obscure label called Family Records, distributed by an even more obscure label, Paramount Records, which was then distributed by ABC Records. You couldn't find this record anywhere. You really had to, it was terrible. And I was getting pissed. People were playing my record, starting to get scratched. I couldn't get a new copy. I figured, you know what? We started doing these concerts. I said, let's get Billy Joel. And I said, well, how do we find him? I said, I don't know. Let me see what I can find out. So I found out that he had an agent named Chip Racklin. So I call up Chip Racklin. Chip later went on to become the head of talent relations at MTV, and he's still an agent today, major agent. I call him up and I go, hi, listen, I want to book Billy Joel for my theater in Allentown. And he goes, you got to be kidding me. He goes, no one has ever called for this guy. Are you sure you don't mean Billy Joel Royal or no, Billy Joel at Cold Spring Harbor? He goes, no, I know what you mean. Let me tell you something. I signed this guy. I saw him at Max's Kansas City. Thought he was great. Cold Spring Harbor comes out. And next thing I know, he's pissed and he quits. He's going to California. And I don't know what he's going to do. I don't know if he's ever going to come back and not going to make another record. But I'll tell you what, if I ever hear from him, I'll give you a call and you can have him. So sure enough, a year and a half later, I get a call. And I know Billy Joel's been re-signed and he's coming out with this album called Piano Man. And Chip, has all his other acts, Doobie Brothers, Beach Boys, et cetera, Jay Gaz. He's got Billy out as the opening act on the Beach Boys and Doobie Brothers tour, which is sort of ridiculous because he's doing a 30-minute she's got away, all the stuff from the first album and from Piano Man, and they're booing him, and it's just not working out.
What is this town? Is this Northampton? Yes? Okay. Anybody here from Philly? Yes? Played in Philly last week, and it was really nice. We've been touring with the Beach Boys, right? And the Doobie Brothers. So you got to dig it. I come on stage, here he is, Billy Jello. Let's really hear it. And it's this whole audience, Beach Boys, Doobie Brothers, boogie, boogie, boogie. So, right?
So I get a call from Chip in, I guess it was end of August. And he goes, listen, you still interested in Billy Joel? I said, oh, yeah, absolutely. He's a big star here. I hear he's got a new record coming out. He goes, yeah, well, we're booking him as an opening act. He's done a couple dates so far. The tour started, and it's just not, we're having an argument as to whether he should even be an opening act or whether he should just headline smaller places like theaters. The only thing he's ever done is he's played clubs, but he's never really headlined anything other than small places, no theaters. I said, okay, well, I'll take him. He's got to do 2 shows, 7 and 10. Tickets are $2. He says, okay, we have one day off, November 25th, right around Thanksgiving. There's a day off on the Beach Boys tour, and he doesn't want to do the Jay Giles tour anymore. So got a day off. You can have him.
We were with a great band. We were with a band called the Jay Giles Band, which is a great band, really. But it was like, Billy Joel and his She's Got Away and the Jay Giles Band, right? And every store we went into, this for 6 months, we hit about every major city, and we'd walk into the store, see if the record was there, right? You got the Billy Joel album? Who? Billy Joel? Yeah, Billy Joe Royal, Billy B.J. Thomas, every Tony Joe White, I don't know, everybody but Billy Joel. So that's really surprising. I guess a radio station must have had it, huh? And played it, yeah? God bless you, man, really.
How much you going to pay him? I said, well, I can only pay him $500. And he paused and he says, okay, that's fine. But you got to do me a favor. I said, what's that? You got to put Henry Gross on as the opening act. I said, well, okay, what's that going to cost me? He goes, $250. I said, okay. Now, Henry Gross had been in Sha Na Na and played Woodstock, and now he's a solo artist. He wasn't really happening at the time, but he later went on to have a big hit called Shannon. If you remember that wimpy, it's actually a pretty good song, but he's like a one-hit wonder. In fact, he's still out playing now, and his show is called One Hit Wonder. And he does that and tells the stories. But we booked Billy Joel, we put the tickets on sale. They sell out in like an hour. And, Billy comes in, the day of the show, his road manager's driving him in by his, remember, it's a white station wagon, comes into the parking lot of the station, walks in, I'm looking through the glass. There he is. Hey, Billy, come on in. Comes on my show. I cannot find the interview that I did with him, and that's lost. Anyway, I do an interview with him, and they're setting up the theater, and my ship's over at 5. I think I was doing 2 to 5 then. And his road manager says, listen, we're having a problem at the theater with the sound. Would you mind driving Billy over to the theater when you're done with the interview? I said, no problem. I'll take him over. I go, wow, this is great. I'm going to drive Billy to the theater. Fantastic. So we finish the interview, and he gets in my car. It's a green Dodge Challenger. We drive from Allentown to where the theater is, which is actually Northampton, Pennsylvania, the Roxy Theater. And we're going the back way, where the factories are in Bethlehem Steel and on that whole area. And I'm going the back way because I know how to get there. I didn't go the regular route. And Billy's looking around. He's going, oh, where is this? What is this place? And I go, well, it's Allentown, but it's actually Northampton, Pennsylvania. But I'm taking the back route. And he goes, wow, this is really something. I go, yeah. And by the way, they're going to love you at this show. You're a big star here. He goes, come on, no one's, this is, I'm excited. And I said, no, you're going to be very excited when you see the crowd. They're going to know every song. They're going to love you. It's going to be a great show. So we get to the theater. I take him in. He looks around. He can't believe it's an old vaudeville theater. It's acoustically perfect. It's amazing. Holds 500 people. And there's a couple of people already waiting there. And he walks in, and there's a big sign in the front that says, welcome, Piano Man, Billy Joel, headlining, opening act, Henry Gross, 2 shows only, And he looks at it, he goes, wow, no one's ever done a sign for me with a headline gig. And he's like so impressed. And we're taking pictures of the sign. And, and then he goes to the back. He looks around. He says, this is great. I said, Billy, you're going to love it. I figured for some reason, I got to record this show. So I had one of those brand new Sony cassette stereo players that you could put in the car and take out, with the dual mics and built in. I take it out of my car and I slam it on the stage because I can, and it's right next to Billy. I mean, you can't get away with that now because the theater is acoustically perfect. It's going to sound really good. So I tape it, and Billy comes out, and he's standing ovation, encore. Can't believe it. Come back. Second show, taped it. And, 40, 50 people waiting for his autograph. And he's like, I can't believe this. 40, 50 people after the second show. And he's like absolutely blown away. And then I have this tape, and who's Billy Joel? He's nobody then. So I play the tape for everybody at the station, and we all think it's great. And I think it's great. And I throw it in the box, and that was the end of it. I didn't think anything of it. And then about 35 years later, I start digitizing my library, and there's a cassette that's marked BJ at RT. I have no idea what it is. So I just throw it in with the rest of the stuff, and comes back, and it's all digitized, and there it is. Beat, it didn't improve. It still says, BJ at RT. So I figure, what the hell is this? And I put it on. Unbelievable. It's Billy Joel, just like I remembered it.
She's got a way about her. I don't know what it is, but I know that I can't live without her. She's got a way.
Whole show. The only thing I didn't get was the encore from the second show, because it was back, those Maxell tapes. They were like 100-minute, 50 minutes on each side, and flip it over. So I got the first show on one side, last song on the first show on side two, except for the encore. The only thing that's annoying is the encore for the second show was so different because he actually ran out of songs. And he told the audience, he goes, look, we only know a 30-minute set. I mean, I was just fooling around and was able to do 40 minutes for the opening show, but we don't have any songs left. And we got 15 minutes to, he asked his manager, 15 minutes to go? Okay, well, I can either start over and play songs again, or I can do some covers. He goes, you want me to do some covers? I'll just, so he proceeds to do Joe Cocker and Elton John, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, and, You Are So Beautiful. And, he's doing cover songs for 15 minutes. And he also throws in one or two of the Cold Spring Harbor tunes that he can do by himself on piano, because the band doesn't know anything. They've only been together 3 weeks. He does that, and that's how it ends. And I didn't get that part of it, but it sounds amazing. And I've recently been in touch with Billy's people, so something might come of it. We'll see. Anyway, that's the Billy Joel story.
Air Check Season 3 is here. Who thought this would happen? I know I didn't. Air Check Season 2 includes episodes featuring Danny Bonaducci, Kid Chris, Debbie Calton, Kirby Confer, Lori Lewis, Fred Jacobs, and more. Air Check Seasons 1, 2, and 3. Available now on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. You can also tell your smart speaker to play Air Check Podcast.
Well, you've been a part of a lot of firsts, and, the Roxy Theater was a venue where a lot of bands played for the very first time, at least in that area anyway, in the Lehigh Valley. What are some of the other bands and artists you were a part of after the Billy Joel experience that you had there?
Let me tell you guys, we booked whoever we wanted to see. That's how ridiculous it was, because we were right between New York and Philly. But if they wanted to play, they had a day off. Rather than lose money, we could pay them not what they would normally get to play New York or Philly, and they would love it because they were working. And it was an audience that they wouldn't normally reach. So, I mean, we were so lucky. We got a reputation to be the place to start if you're doing a tour. So when Blood, Sweat, and Tears got back together with David Clayton Thomas, and they were doing 3 weeks, and they were going to do the Bottom Line, they needed a rehearsal. They played the Roxy as the rehearsal. Electric Flag got back together with Mike Bloomfield. That lasted 2 weeks. They needed a place to start. National Lampoon Radio players. We did them in the early days. They needed a place. They were appearing on Broadway eventually, and they were doing warm-ups at theaters. I remember we tried to do Peter Gabriel with Genesis, and the stage was 10 feet too short. Couldn't do it. Got Roxy Music. Got Frampton. Nazareth's First Date in America was there. Golden Earrings' First Date in America. Boy, were they allowed. Just about anybody we wanted. We did Kiss. We did Outrageous Bills. Did Rush at least 3 times. I think John Rutsey was actually the drummer the first time I booked him. I don't remember if he actually showed up but I know he was the drummer at the time. I recorded a half a dozen shows. I wish I had recorded every show. It would be unbelievable.
Another first that you were a part of was the very first music infomercial. And that actually includes one of the most famous radio DJs that there ever was, Wolfman Jack. Talk a little bit about that.
If you know who Danny Goldberg is, he's a prominent manager, managed Nirvana. He was Led Zeppelin's head of Swan Song in America. He's a publicist, president of Warner Brothers. Anyway, he wrote a book, and he used a title that Ahmet Ertegun used to use all the time, talking about how lucky he was because all he did was bump into geniuses. So, and Danny said that was the key to his career, was bumping into geniuses. And it's sort of like the same thing here. Every time I turn around, I bump into somebody that was doing something unbelievable. So accidentally, again, I get a call. This is in when was this? 79, 78, somewhere in there. I get a call from this guy, Kevin Harrington, whose company called Quantum Media, and they're based right outside of Philadelphia. And he's like the guy that invented the infomercial. He and this other guy, we're doing infomercials. And I can't go into the whole story of how infomercials came about, but it's a pretty fascinating story. But they were doing them completely, infomercials. And he's the guy that took the walk. That's why everybody has a walk today, because, of the infomercial. He would look and people would come to him and say, look, I got this product. I got all these pieces. I don't know what to do with it. And he would say, we'll create an infomercial. Somebody approached him and said, look, I got 50,000 sets of cassette oldies packages, and the company went out of business. Do you want them? He says, sure. So he called me and says, I need somebody to consult me on the music side of this. And I said, well, what are you doing? He goes, oh, I'm doing a music infomercial. And I said, a what? An what? And he goes, infomercial. I said, I don't know what that is, but I'll meet with you. And I'm flattered. And he tells me what he's got to do. He's got to do a half-hour show that looks like a real show, but is a commercial. So Kevin says, yeah, I got all these oldies packages, and we're going to make a TV show that's really a commercial, and we're going to sell it. And I need to know what you think, And I said, well, there's a club around here called Pulsations. I think we should shoot it there, and let's get an oldies expert. I said, there's only one person, Wolfman Jack. We get Wolfman Jack, and he agrees. He doesn't know what an infomercial is either. So he agrees to it, and he's getting paid.
Ladies and gentlemen, boppers and rockers, Wolfman Jack.
Hello?
Welcome to the Jukebox Cafe. May I take your order, please?
Yeah, I want that special. Let me have that special rock and roll music. Yeah!
We do this commercial, and I'm watching Kevin, and I'm sitting there in amazement. I'm watching this guy, and he's actually doing a sales pitch that you'd see on the boardwalk in Atlantic City, only it's a half hour long. And every 2 minutes he breaks and says, now, if you want this package of oldies, and the Wolfman's great because he's, he's pleading, these are the greatest songs ever made. He's phenomenal. And it's $99 for the package of 50, 100 songs. I don't remember how many there were, but real classic stuff. And they put the infomercial on, and they test it. Now, again, this is all new to me. They put it on in a couple cities and see how it does before they roll it out. They put it out there, and like nothing happened. They sold 3 copies. So Kevin says, okay. And I said, so I guess that's it, huh? He goes, no. We're going to make some adjustments. And, he says, I'm going to try something I haven't tried before. I said, what's that? He goes, well, I know that it works because I've seen it work, but nobody's done it in this business, but I'm going to try it. And he goes, we're not going to say it's $100 or $99. We're just not going to mention. We're going to charge $33, 3 payments of $33.33 each. So Wolfman, you go out, and at the end, you're going to plead for the audience. It's $33.33 a month, 3 months. That's it. This is the greatest gift from your buddy, the Wolfman. I mean, really put his pitch into it. And Kevin was just brilliant. And I never knew he'd end up on Shark Tank. And he's the infomercial king. I mean, he literally invented the business and has just everybody else that's done it has duplicated him. So that was the first infomercial. And I ended up doing a second one about 2 years later. We rented out Channel 12 in Philadelphia, WHYY, and used the studio audience, created a fake award show. And I got Don Kirshner, who I was working with at the time, to host it, because there for a little, before Dick Clark did the American Music Awards, there was the Don Kirshner Music Awards. They only lasted like 2 or 3 years, but it got replaced by Dick Clark. So I said, Don, let's recreate the Don Kirshner Music Awards. And, it'll be an infomercial.
From Philadelphia, the home of rock and roll, it's Don Kirshner's Rock Awards, hosted by legendary Monkee star Davy Jones. Tonight, join us as we search for the 60s record of the decade with special guest presenters from the Tokens, Jay Siegel. From the Young Rascals, Felix Cavallari. From the Brooklyn Bridge, Johnny Maestro. From the McCoys, Rick Derringer. From the Archies, Ron Dante. Plus a special appearance by the man who has been at the center of rock and roll for 3 decades, who discovered and developed artists such as Bobby Darin, the Monkees, Neil Sedaka, Carole King, and many others, and who brought rock concerts to network TV, rock legend Don Kirshner.
I have all these records. It's the first time a record package, this is 1990, had been offered on CD. And I remember calling up the head of special markets at CBS Record, and because I had to license the music. The guy says, you're going to do a what? I said, we're going to do a music infomercial. He said the same thing I said. He goes, an infoca what? And I said, it's an infomercial. I said, we're going to sell the package, but it's going to be on a half-hour TV show. He goes, well, listen, okay, we'll do it. I have no idea what you're talking about, but you got to buy, you got to buy at least 2,500 copies, whatever it was. They put all these restrictions on it, and it was fine with me. We did it, and everybody knocked us off. I remember getting a call from the people over at Rhino. Hey, that was a great infomercial we saw you had with Davy Jones. We're going to knock you off. Okay, nothing you can do about it. Rolling Stone magazine started doing infomercials. Everybody, Time Life, everybody got into it. But that was the first time anybody had ever done it.
Very cool. Now, Rich mentioned, Denny, you guys were both among the WYSP Philadelphia alumni. You were at YSP in the late
94,
70s.
right, Rich?
Well, yeah, right.
That's before your time,
Before my time, yeah, absolutely.
Both there in the late 70s, early 80s. Rich, obviously 20 years later. As a listener to YSP back then, I remember hearing you doing a break. We were talking about the new Yes album coming out. It was Drama, and it was the album without John Anderson. And so as another first on your resume, you were instrumental in pulling off the very first live broadcast from Madison Square Garden in New York. And it's a Yes concert without John Anderson and without much fanfare. What happened?
Again, I was sort of thrown into it. I was working for NBC's Source Radio Network, and they said, we really need to do a concert. And everybody else is doing recorded concerts. Let's do one live from the Garden. And you know this better than anybody, when you haven't done something before and somebody says, hey, let's do this, you go, yeah, sure, why not? I could do that. I mean, you don't even think of, can you imagine today, union problems? It would be ridiculous to try and think of even doing it. But we got so far into it. And then NBC was so into it. And then, we pulled it off. And I'm still amazed that we did it. There was so much, quote unquote, drama going on.
Now Yes is back with two newcomers, Jeff Downs and Trevor Horn, joining their more seasoned colleagues in continuing the Yes idea. The artists they are joining are Steve Howe, Alan White, and founding member Chris Squire.
It turned out to be the fourth date on the tour that we did, and they really were hoping it was going to sell because they were having problems. People were, wondering, well, is this going to sound like Yes? Do we want our money back? Are we going to do it? They pulled it off. They ended up selling out all the shows as usual. But for a while there, it was touch and go. We're an hour into the show, and the manager goes, okay, that's it. I go, what do you mean that's it? That's the end. Cut it off. I said, what?
Before we play the next song, I'd like to thank you for being a really great audience tonight. This is our last song.
She goes, nope, I don't want any more. You had an hour live, and we had to cut the concert off. Oh. He takes the tapes, and he walks away. So nobody knew. It was an hour, yes. And we said, part two, you'll be able to hear it in a couple of weeks as an encore presentation, the whole thing. But we made up with. It was unbelievable. This is all going on backstage at the Madison Square Garden in the trucks when the band's out there trying to play. But we got through it. It was pretty cool to do that. They ended up playing 2 more nights at Madison Square Garden. So I got to see those shows. They were great.
This is an Air Check Rewind, Season 2. Kirby Confer.
Kirby, there's somebody on the phone from Capitol Records. They need somebody to MC some gig. I don't know. And the guy said, this is Bill Turner from Capitol Records. We've got an act coming in. We're wondering, all the other DJs are busy, the guys who are the famous guys on our station. And, would you be available? And I said, yeah, I think I'm available. I said, fine. We'll send you a contract for $200. Would that be adequate? Yes, sir. That would be wonderful. Thank you. So I ran up to call the program director, a guy named Johnny Dark. And I said, Johnny, I got my first gig. He said, what is it? I don't know, Johnny. I got really excited. I'll have to call the guy back. I called Bill Turner back and I said, what is it? He said, you haven't heard of him. He said, but they're big in England. They're called the Beatles.
Air Check, a podcast about radio's personality from Radio Personalities. Seasons 1 and 2 available now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. You can also listen on your smart speaker. Just say, Alexa, play Air Check Podcast, or OK Google, play Air Check Podcast.
Well, from producing a Billy Joel concert and the many shows that came through the Roxy, putting the Yes show in Madison Square Garden, live broadcast as a first. We're seeing a lot of firsts that you did. I mean, when you got to that point in your career, did you realize, all right, the skill set that I'm developing here and these opportunities that are in front of me, is that what made you start a production company? How did Denny Somach Productions get going?
Paul, I still wanted to be a stockbroker. I still wanted to be a stockbroker. I was treading. I was, balls in the air. I was doing whatever I had to do. And I figured, okay, I'm 25 years old. I could do this for a few more years. And by the time I'm 30 years old, I'm going to do this for another, okay, eventually I'll get to do what I want to do. But this is a cool job in between. I mean, I never made more. This is $1970, $1980. I never made more than like $39,000 being a disc jockey and doing all the other stuff that you do. Appearances and, everything. I think my salary was $32,000 or something. So I had to just keep doing stuff. And the opportunity to NBC announced they were doing this radio network called The Source. and they put out a general call for anybody who wanted to present some program ideas. And a couple of people called me up and said, hey, you got a couple good ideas. Why don't you, see what happens? Take them up there and see what goes on. So I did that for a while as a sort of a part-time job, and then realized, this could be a real business. So I quit my job in the early 80s and went full-time into my production company, and just kept going from there, thinking I'll do this until I can get back to business school,
I mean, the firsts continue, and, each one of these firsts has a similarity to it, but a different spin on it. And another one of your firsts was your involvement in the very first live national cablecast of a concert featuring Upper Darby's own Todd Rundgren. Now, cablecast, that had to be a new term back then. And how did this happen?
Again, nobody had done it. I was working on this concert series called Hotspots on the USA Network, and it was a weekly hour concert series. We'd go around the country and shoot whatever group was in the area. We got a lot of headliners, but a lot of times there were 2 acts, opening acts, and I would put on up-and-coming acts. And I put the Hooters on it. That's how they got their record deal. Somebody saw them on the show. They were on before they had a record deal. So I got a call from Todd Rundgren's manager, and he goes, look, Todd would like to do the show. And I figured, wow, that's pretty good. Todd wants to do our concert show. And he goes, no. We want to do it live. And I said, well, we're not live. We're live to tape. And he goes, yeah, I know, but we want to do live because no one's done that before. And I said, well, you ask and I'll ask and we'll see what happens. And sure enough, next thing you know, the record company at the time, I think it was Geffen and USA Network, everybody agreed that we would do this live from the Country Club in Los Angeles. And Todd Rundgren's Utopia was going to play live. Happened to be the right place, the right time.
Take a look at the things that you can see, all the mystic treasury, and you get them for free if we're in ultra.
So we're talking about the different productions. I mean,
yes.
Todd Rundgren, the live national cable cast. Got to ask you about MTV. MTV appears. Sure enough, Denny Somach appears too.
Well, you got to try and be everywhere. You got to be everywhere. You got to nag everybody, and
all of a sudden,
kind of cool. Mark Goodman was one of the original VJs, and he worked at. By the way, WSAN had a bunch of people. Mark Goodman worked there. Cindy Drew worked there. George Harris worked there. Lynn Kratz, who was on overnights and MMR for 15, 20 years. They all came out of that station. It was a great learning experience. Anyway, so MTV goes on the air. Now, I'm already doing a couple of things in TV because I started to get into it in 79. And one of them was Cindy Drew had a local TV show called The Rock and Roll Show in Philadelphia on Channel 3. And it had come out of her doing these little breaks in the news called The Rock Report. So she asked me to help her work on that show. I did because I had good relations with talent. The show was a monthly show, but we were on for like a year and a half before MTV came on the scene. So we figured, let's go up and pitch some stuff to MTV because how many people can say they're already doing TV? Went up and had a meeting with them, was asked to put together, because I was already doing the Rock Report for The Source, and MTV needed a rock news service. So they hired me to put their rock news service together. It was MTV News. They also didn't have a year-end show. Now, I had done a radio show for NBC called The News That Rock 80, which is all the big news events of the year, rock and roll, speaking. So I sold that concept to MTV with the proviso that MTV could have it because they were only on in 14 million homes. And I wanted to keep the rights to sell it to commercial television because my partner at the time had connections and we were able to get it on Channel 2 in New York, WCBS, and the WNEW-FM simulcast in stereo. It was kind of cool.
Hi, I'm Mark Goodman, and this is the news that rocked 81. For the next hour, we'll take a look at some of the major musical events of the year just past. We'll review some of the top albums, concert events, personnel changes, and we'll see your favorite performers. Later in the show, we're going to feature the song of the year. You'll definitely want to stick around for that. All this and a whole lot more as we present the news that rocked 81.
But anyway, so we did the year-end show for MTV. Mark Goodman was the host. We did the second year, News That Rocked 82. And then in 83, I was able to get Julian Lennon to host it. And in 84, I got Phil Collins to host it. And one of the reasons I got Phil Collins to host it, although no one will admit it, but I know, is he was asked to do Miami Vice, and he didn't have an audition tape. So somebody said, well, why don't you do this show? Then you'll have an audition tape.
Get out.
And that's it. Yep. I mean, I'm sure if we were idiots, he wouldn't have done it. But it was easy enough. He was looking for a reason, and we were looking for a host. He loved the concept, and anyway. So I did that for 4 years, and then they started doing their own show, The Year in Rock. But that's how that came about, and that's how my association with MTV came about. And then when I was done with all that, I got hired by Ted Turner to work at the cable music channel. But that's a whole nother story for another day. Nobody remembers it. Although it was sold and it became VH1. A lot of people don't know, but there was no VH1. There was a cable music channel and MTV, and then MTV announced, well, we're going to have another channel. It's going to be called VH1, but there was no VH1. What they ended up doing is they bought the cable music channel from Ted Turner, and they renamed it VH1.
VH1 presents the history of video music. In the beginning, there was radio, great sound, terrible picture. Then came television. Great picture. Hold your ears. Next, there was MTV. For some people, it looked and sounded great. Now, there's VH1, the one in digital Dolby stereo sound. The right sound for the right one.
VH1. Well, June 18th of this year, 2021, the 10th anniversary of Clarence Clemons' death. One of the many encounters Paul has had in his career includes interviewing Clarence Clemons, and that interview is highlighted in in season 1, episode 1 of Air Check. But you had an interesting sit down with the big man yourself. Talk a little bit about that and why that happened and how that all went down.
Well, in the early 2000s, and I saw what was happening in the radio business, I figured there's got to be other places to do what I guess is now called branded entertainment. But at the time, it was like, hey, I can do a radio show. If you have a book coming out or a movie or something you want to project, don't wait for somebody to come and say, hey, we'll put a radio show together. I got people that'll clear it. As long as you're with a publisher, so long as it gets paid for, we don't need a network. We'll just do it. So I started doing those for people. And we did a bunch of them. I did Eric Clapton's autobiography, Clapton. I did Don Felder's book. I did a Van Halen book. I did something for Ann and Nancy Wilson. Clarence Clemons put out a book. It was supposed to be an autobiography, but it was really a goof autobiography. It was half true and half made up. If you've read it, you'll know what I mean. It's called, Tall Tales and Great Stories by the big man himself. And he wrote it with a guy, friend of his, who's a television producer. I was hired by the book company to do the official radio show on Clarence's book. Well, that meant we'd go in and sit down with Clarence and do an interview, and he'd have to answer anything because it was an autobiography. And that's when you can get away with murder because they're not going to hold back. It's in the book. I insisted on also recording it with video, which I did because I wanted to. At the time, I was starting a YouTube channel, and that's where a lot of these little pieces you'll see it. It's my channel is Classic Rock Archives. You can see a lot of these clips.
This girl Karen is routing me. She says, "I got this friend. You got to meet him. You got to meet this guy." And she every time we went somewhere, you got to meet this guy, Bruce. I said, okay. One day we're gonna meet him. And about 2 months it took before I had a chance to really meet him because I was always working. And he was always working. And so we happened to be playing in Asbury Park at the same time. I played in a matinee, and he was at the Wonder Bar, which was about 3 blocks north of the Student Prince. And big northeaster blew in and started raining this night, and I was just leaving the club. And I walked down to the Student Prince, and it was thunder and lightning. And Bruce tells this story, and it's really true. And I walked into the club, and opened the door, and the wind actually tore the door out of my hand and blew it down the street. So all the bouncers go running down the street after the door, and I'm standing there with this lightning and thunder behind me, and I walk in. It's a black guy walking to a white club. I was like, whoa, wait a minute. And I walked over to Bruce. I found out who Bruce was, and I walked over and said, I want to sit in. He said, sure, whatever you want to do. So I sat in, and it was a magical moment.
So I was there with Clarence, and I just figured, you got to take a shot every once in a while. Questions that you would normally you were concerned about asking because you didn't want the interview to end, but I knew the interview wasn't going to end because we weren't done, and he was paying for it. So I figured, okay, I'm going to ask some questions that I might not, or I'd be hesitant to ask until the end or whatever, but I'm just going to ask them because it's part of the book. So I had never seen the actual or heard anybody tell the actual story of when the E Street Band was fired by Bruce. So I figured this is a better opportunity than anybody. I said, Clarence, you got to tell me minute by minute, what happened when Bruce told you there was no more band? And he went into one of the best 2.5 minutes that I've ever heard. And it's on episode number 3 of The Rock Podcast. Now, of course, you being radio guys, you're saying, well, what about when Bruce rehired the band? I said, well, of course I asked him that. And of course I'm holding it back. That'll be on episode 16. Okay.
Air Check. Some of radio's greatest stories from some of radio's greatest. Air Check Season 2 includes episodes with Danny Bonaducci, Kid Chris, Debbie Calton, Kirby Confer, Lori Lewis, and Fred Jacobs. Air Check Seasons 1, 2, and 3. Available now on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. You can also tell your smart speaker to play Air Check Podcast.
Well, you mentioned Charlie Kendall a second ago. He was part of WMMR's history, but also part of MMR's sister station.
He was part of Album Rock's history.
There you go. But also MMR's sister station at the time, WNEW in New York.
Right.
You were part of a few radio personalities' careers as a manager, one being John DeBella, WMMR, and of course now WMGK, and Danny Bonaducci from, of course, the Partridge Family, who started his radio career here in Philadelphia in the late 80s. But you were also part of something that was a big deal in the New York market, the 20th anniversary broadcast from London for the legendary New York disc jockey, the late, great Scott Muni. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, again, that was Charlie Kendall. He came to me and he said, look, we got to do something for Scott. It's his anniversary. What do you think we should do? I've got a budget. We've got to do something, but, let's just try and figure something out. And I said, well, Charlie, what's Scott's big thing over 20 years? It's things from England. It's all these English acts that come over here, and the Who and the Yes and Zeppelin. And he's had John Lennon. Everybody's been on Scott's show. Everybody comes to America. They think Scott is America, American radio. I mean, you say to the Pete Townsend of the Who, American radio, he says, Scott Muni, WNEW. I said, Scott has a reputation, and I think we should exploit it. And he goes, well, I can't afford to fly all those English rock stars over here for interviews. I said, no. Let's do the opposite. He goes, what do you mean? I goes, let's take Scott to England and do the show from England and invite all these people. Who's going to say no? They can't give you the excuses. Oh, well, we don't have time. We're not going to be there. Everybody we call is going to want to do it. We're going to have to turn people away. And he said, great idea. And we sat down and we mapped out the whole thing. And that's what's great about Charlie. He will get into something, and we came up with it, and Scott loved it. It was great, and we ended up doing it 3 more times. I'll tell you a funny story. Scott, was a magnet. We were at a restaurant in London called La Gavroche, one of the best restaurants in the world. And I had to go take Scott wherever he wanted to have dinner. Had nothing to do with it. He wanted to eat there. Anyway, we were eating there. Scott looks over. Across the aisle is Roger Taylor of Queen. Now, Queen at the time was, of course, one of the hottest bands in the world. And we were unable to get a hold of anybody from Queen's office. We probably just weren't looking the right place, or they were, whatever it was. They were scattered around the world at the time doing different things. But anyway, so there's Roger Taylor. So Scott says, excuse me, watch this. And he goes over to the table, and I see him, and he's talking to Roger Taylor, and I hear Roger go, Scott, what are you doing here? He goes, I'm over here doing shows. I want your band on my show. And he goes, oh, absolutely. When do you want me? And he comes on the next day, and it was great. And apparently I ended up paying the check, although I don't remember that.
So I didn't know Roger was in town. Queen has an album happening. We have a premiere performance for America from you too.
But I must say,
up.
I never knew you had such expensive eating tastes.
Yeah, that was an expensive restaurant.
Actually, I went in that restaurant that night, and the reason I left was because the young lady I was with was feeling incredibly ill. It's about the most expensive restaurant in London. She has to feel ill when we get in there. Yeah. But anyway, she felt better and we came back.
That's exactly what I said. It's exactly what I figured. No, it is. I think it is. Well, if it isn't the most expensive, it borders on it.
Well, it's supposed to be one of the best ones, I think.
But my producer picked up the tab. Denny picked up the tab, so it was easy for
me. We should have picked up mine.
And the food is excellent, too, by the way. And it's a kind of place if you don't get your reservation in, you just don't get in there at all.
I tried that once, and Pat Benatar laughed in my face.
It was just the idea, though, that the only person that could have done that would be Scott. Because, first of all, Roger Taylor's he's looking, well, I know who this guy is because I see him in New York all the time, but what's he doing here? What does he want to talk to me for? So then I realized, oh, he's doing an anniversary show. Okay, great. So it worked out great.
You were at Wembley for the Live Aid thing. And I was in Philadelphia at the time at the other stadium. And isn't it amazing how that was coordinated?
Yes, I never thought it would come off, actually. I remember speaking with Bob Geldof 6 months before when he first had the idea. And he asked us to play. I said, sure, we'd love to. I don't think he'll ever pull it off. It sounds impossible. But, of course, if you do, and he did, it's a triumph of organisation, really.
Well, we had everybody on. Roger Daltrey. We had Alan Parsons, we had Ronnie Wood, we had David Gilmour. Just about everybody was on the show.
Well, as we all know here in Philly, and he has been referenced in season 2 with Debbie Cowton, the late DJ Ed Shockey was synonymous with Bruce Springsteen. I think the story goes that Ed let Bruce sleep on his couch in the early days. But equally close were Scott Muni and John Lennon. And you yourself have an affinity with John Lennon and the Beatles. You wrote the book called Walking Down Abbey Road. Before we get to the book, there was a national Beatles show, Ticket to Ride, that Scott was a part of. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I had noticed that there was a weekly Beatles show in every country. There was one in Germany, there was one in Japan, there was one in Australia. There was none in America. There were local breakfasts with the Beatles. They were all over the country. Different people were doing them. And I just thought, there should be a national one. Where can I find somebody that would be the proper host? So I was talking to Scott one day and I told him the idea. And I told him I was, trying to come up with somebody and would he be interested in doing it? And of course, he was the perfect host because he had been at the Plaza Hotel when the Beatles arrived, along with, Cousin Brucey. And they're probably the only two guys that were still in radio at the time that were there when the Beatles came in. And their stories were firsthand. And Scott loved the idea. So the idea was, we'll do a show. We'll play Beatles songs and we'll have guests on like Billy Joel and like Phil Collins. And they'll come on and play their favorite Beatles songs. And Scott will relate different stories. And
hi, this is Eric Bazillion from the Hooters. And you're on board Scott Muni's Ticket to Ride.
We're back. I'm Scott Muni. And Eric Brazilian and Rob Hyman of the Hooters are our guests this week on Ticket to Ride.
We ended up going to Liverpool a couple of times and recording some shows there. And, I remember trying to get the show going and everybody said to me, it'll be great. It'll be a great 10-week show. Anyway, the show lasted 10 years. So it was fun. Probably the most fun of anything.
And that radio show then became the book, Ticket to Ride, published in 1989. You appeared on the Larry King Live show to talk about the Beatles, and you had a very special guest along with you. Talk a little bit about that moment.
Oh, yeah, that's where I met Louise Harrison, and she was the sweetest, George Harrison's sister. First of all, she looks just like him.
Sid Bernstein, who brought them over, correct, booked them after he'd read about them in England, had not seen them.
That's correct. He was reading newspapers. He was taking a course in New York, yeah.
Told me that they didn't want to come till they had a hit in the United States. They didn't want to come and be a failure.
That's absolutely right. They were huge everywhere else in the world except here, and they wanted to come here when they were number one everywhere else.
And that song was what?
I Want to Hold Your Hand, because they had Please Please Me had come out, and From Me to You had come out and nothing happened. Then I Want to Hold Your Hand came out. In fact, the first disc jockey to play it was a disc jockey from Washington, a guy named Carol James.
Yes, I remember meeting him.
His sister or something was a stewardess on BOAC, and she brought it in November, I believe, and he started playing
where, in Washington?
In Washington.
So Washington, D.C. was the first place the Beatles were ever heard in this
correct.
country?
However, the first person to show them on television was not Sullivan. There were two others. It was Jack Parr. Well, even before Jack Parr had a clip on in late January. From England. But in November of '63, Walter Cronkite had a piece with Morley Safer interviewing the Beatles in England. In fact, CBS still has it because I saw it about 7 or 8 years ago. Now, Cronkite had him on the news. By the time he got off, this is in my book, by the time he gets off, on the 6:30, by the time he got off the air,
in England.
That's right. He got a call from Sullivan saying, well, who were those guys? I got, and Cronkite says, they would have eventually come over anyway, and Sullivan would have found out, but that's the first time Sullivan saw them, was on the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
What was that like, that show? I mean, Larry, you just recently passed away, but he was a powerhouse on CNN with that show. And prior to that, in his career prior to the television years, that must have been a pretty special moment for you.
He was one of the best interviewers ever. Some people say he was full of himself and all that, but he was a great interviewer. And I have one great story that I'd like to tell you about Larry King, just to show you how authentic this guy is and how doing your research is really the key to doing great interviews. So we go to commercial and I lean over and Larry says, I'm going to tell you a story. You're going to want to know this one. I had Arthur Fiedler on from the Boston Pops, one of the most well-known classical orchestra leaders. I think he's passed away now. He goes, I had him on as a guest one day, and we went to commercial, and I leaned over and I said to him, who are the best composers of the 20th century? And he said, Lennon and McCartney.
No kidding.
Oh my God, there's the greatest. He's saying Lennon and McCartney are the greatest, and he's like the greatest. And Larry King, the story he wanted to tell me was that.
That's awesome.
Well, along with Ticket to Ride, you have a new book about the Beatles. Rich mentioned it earlier, Walking Down Abbey Road.
It's actually called A Walk Down Abbey Road.
Other than writing these books, you've been involved in licensing Beatles merchandise. Tell us a little bit about that.
We put together a series of lithographs of the Beatles album artwork. This is in the 90s. I think it was just a little bit ahead of its time. We put them out and we did marketing around the Beatles anthology. And it was a lot of fun. We didn't do a lot of them, but they disappeared. It's now 30 years on, and they sell as collector's items.
Well, we can't let you go without talking about your other book, Get the Let Out, How Led Zeppelin Became the Biggest Band in the World. As a Zeppelin geek myself, I am a drooler when it comes to that band. What sparked that adventure for you?
I'm a big Yardbirds fan. Always have been. And anybody that knows anything about rock and roll knows that the Yardbirds, next to the Beatles and the Stones, are the most influential British rock band of all time. And they happen to have shared 3 guitar players, Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, and Jimmy Page. And they actually... the new Yardbirds was what Led Zeppelin was before they were Led Zeppelin. So my love of Zeppelin came from love of the Yardbirds and just following through on that. And I realized that they're just one of those bands that everybody loves. They have done something that very few people have done. They have become cross-generational. It's something that didn't really happen for Sinatra. There are Sinatra fans, but he didn't cross over. It didn't really happen for Elvis. There's Elvis fans, but he didn't cross over for a whole new thing. They're fans. It happened for the Beatles. It happened for the Stones. It's now happened for Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin. And I think there may be 1 or 2 others that could come, but those are the 4 pillars of rock and roll. And so I'm like everybody else, big fan, had the opportunity to meet them all, interview them, meet all the world's big Zeppelin collectors, and geeky as they are about collecting stuff. And you just figured, well, might as well collect all this stuff. People were saying, hey, you get some interviews, and I would only end up using a couple of minutes. And I just figured it'd be a waste to let all these go. So I took 25 of them and put them in the book. Then I contacted the biggest Led Zeppelin collector in the world, who happens to live in Virginia, has a $4 million collection. I can't tell you where he lives. Keeps everything in his house. I went down and I photographed his collection, and that's what's in the book. And then I did a chronology timeline from when they started to when they ended, and put together a fake 4th chapter about them doing a reunion concert and a live album coming from it and everything else. And lo and behold, by sheer luck, when the book came out, and I had made up what the album would look like, the live, I took the poster of the concert, Led Zeppelin live at the O2 Arena. And sure enough, they actually did the concert, and, but they never put the record out. But then they put the record out right when I was putting the book out, which was, great. And then they got the Kennedy Honors, and everything else was falling into place, and I happen to have the book out. So,
Denny, I think you created lightning in a bottle. I think you were the creator of that, of all these stories, of all the things that you cross paths with. It's just amazing stories, amazing tale, amazing career that you continue to add to. And as they say, things go full circle. Nothing different here as we end this aircheck session. Led Zeppelin just so happens to be the subject of your first episode of your classic rock podcast, The Rock Podcast with Denny Somach. Can we play a little clip from that episode here?
Sure. I'll play you something. Let me see here. Let me think about what I'm going to play, and I'll play you something because it's not just guys from Led Zeppelin. I got 19 people on this show. Everybody from Mark Farner of Grand Funk to Simon Kirke of Bad Company to, it was Carmine Appice, who was John Bonham's, mentor. All these guys are telling Bonham stories. So yeah, I'll pull something out here from somebody. You'll recognize it. We all know Simon Kirke from his amazing work as a founding member of the band Free, as well as the supergroup Bad Company. He recalls the first time he met John Bonham, which it wasn't with Bad Company. He actually met him when he was 19 years old. He came to New York for the first time with the band Free, right when they released their big hit, All Right Now.
My very, very first memory of Bonzo was when Free came to New York, opening for Blind Faith, with four little kids. We were sat in this Irish bar on 8th and 48th. We just arrived. We were terrified because we'd been turned over by the customs in JFK. I mean, turned inside out because of our hair. So we were absolutely terrified. First time I'd seen a gun on a hip and the police. Anyway, so we're sitting there nursing our little Budweiser or whatever, and the barman comes over and he's got 4 pints of Guinness and he puts them down on the table between us. He said, "That's from that guy over there." And it's Bonzo. And he goes, welcome to America, guys. And he didn't know us. Maybe he'd heard of us, but I think that's John Bonham. Wow. And, and he got up and walked out. And that was the first time I'd ever met him.
Wow. The Rock Podcast with Denny Somach, John Bonham, also episodes on The Doors, The Beatles, Cream, Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band, Tom Petty. Good stuff there, Denny. Hey, thank you so much for your time today. Paul and I appreciate you setting some time to be on this Air Check session. It's been a lot of fun. Lots of luck on your new podcast and all your current and future endeavors. You've always got your toe dipped in some body of water, and it's always fun to see what you got coming up on the horizon. Again, thank you so much.
Well, I'm flattered that you asked me. I would like to say something. I came to Philadelphia in the 70s, and I met Sonny Fox, and I worked for him for 2 years, and he was one of the most influential people on my career. He introduced me to Lee Abrams, who also had a huge influence on my career, and also through those associations, I met someone who's arguably one of the 2 or 3 best programmers anywhere, Charlie Kendall. So I've had a chance to work with some really great people and to see them. I mean, even when I was in Philly, Jeff Pollack was across the street at WMMR. So I watched him put that whole empire together. So I just had the opportunity to work among a lot of smart people. And, that's really a lot of it.
Denny, thank you. It looks like I've got some reading to do, and whatever else we see coming down the pike, we won't be surprised if Denny Somach's name is attached to it.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Rich, and good luck to you. You're off to a good start. The show sounds great.
That's Denny. What a storied career.
And a couple more books to add to my summer reading list.
Aircheck Season 3 just getting started, and more surprises to come. Programmers and air talent from country radio, record label reps, rock radio, and a top 40 emperor from 1960s AM radio.
You can stream or download every episode of Aircheck on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. You can also tell your smart speaker to play Aircheck Podcast. If you haven't done so yet, give us a great rating.
This is Rich DeSisto.
And I'm Paul Kelly.
We'll talk to you soon.
Closing out another episode of Aircheck, a podcast about radio's personality from radio personalities. If you have radio stories to share, we'd love to hear from you. Join the Aircheck guest list. Email aircheckme@gmail.com. Musical props are Chris Gordon's. Announcer props, I'll take those. Greg O'Brien, the OB. Aircheck is available now on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. You can also tell your smart speaker to play Aircheck Podcast. Aircheck is the creation of RDPK Productions.